Have you ever heard of a man so wise, so powerful, and so blessed by God, yet who lost everything because of his own choices? Imagine having a mind so brilliant that rulers from around the world sought your counsel. Imagine possessing a fortune so vast that silver was considered worthless in your kingdom. Imagine building a temple so glorious that even today, thousands of years later, people still marvel at its splendor. This man had all of that and more. He was chosen by God, anointed as king, and gifted with wisdom beyond human understanding. His name became a symbol of divine insight, his words recorded in Scripture as guidance for generations. And yet, his story did not end in triumph. What if I told you that this king's final years were nothing like the grand legacy most imagine? That behind the gold, the wisdom, and the power, there was something far darker. Something the Bible only hints at? He was the wisest man who ever lived, and yet in the end, he became a man ruled by his own desires. His heart, once fully devoted to God, slowly drifted away, drawn by influences that he once warned others against. How does a man who spoke so eloquently about wisdom fall into foolishness? How does someone entrusted with building God's temple turn to idols? And what mysterious stories surround his final days? Stories that some say hold hidden truths? Today, we uncover the rise, reign, and ruin of this legendary figure. We'll explore the forgotten details, the shocking betrayals, and the mystery surrounding his last moments. Before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep biblical insights. Now, let's step back in time and witness the life of one of history's most fascinating and complicated figures. Before he became one of the most powerful and wealthiest rulers in history, he was simply a boy, overshadowed by scandal, political rivalries, and uncertainty. His story begins in the palace of King David, a man after God's own heart, but also a ruler marked by personal failures. Solomon was not David's firstborn son, nor was he the most obvious heir. In fact, his very existence was the result of one of the most controversial and tragic chapters in David's life. His mother, Bathsheba, was originally the wife of Uriah the Hittite, a loyal soldier in David's army. But David's fateful sin, his affair with Bathsheba, and the subsequent murder of her husband, led to severe consequences. Their first child together died as divine judgment. Yet, in an act of mercy, God allowed Bathsheba to conceive again, and this time she bore a son, Solomon. From the beginning, Solomon's life was marked by divine purpose. The prophet Nathan, who had condemned David's sin, was the very one who later declared that Solomon was chosen by God. The name Solomon means peace, but Nathan also gave him a second name, Jedediah, meaning beloved of the Lord, a sign that, despite the scandal of his origins, God had a plan for him. However, there was a problem. Solomon was not the natural heir to the throne. David had many sons, and the most ambitious of them was Adonijah, a strong and charismatic prince who saw himself as the rightful king. As David's health declined, Adonijah seized the opportunity. He gathered his allies, Joab, the commander of the army, and Abiathar, the high priest, and declared himself king even before David had died. In a grand feast, he celebrated his reign, expecting the people of Israel to accept him as their ruler. But he underestimated one thing: God's promise. When Bathsheba and the prophet Nathan heard what was happening, they acted quickly. They approached the dying King David, reminding him of his oath that Solomon would be his successor. Moved by their words and led by divine will, David gave a clear command. Solomon was to be anointed as king immediately. The scene was dramatic. While Adonijah feasted with his supporters, Solomon was secretly brought to Gihon, where the high priest Zadok anointed him with sacred oil. The sound of trumpets filled the air, and the people shouted, "Long live King Solomon!" The city erupted in celebration, and Adonijah's party was thrown into chaos. Word reached Adonijah, and fear gripped him. He realized that his attempted coup had failed. In desperation, he ran to the altar, clinging to the horns in hopes of mercy. Solomon spared him, for now, but this was only the beginning. The young king's rise to power was not yet secure. To fully claim his throne, Solomon had to make difficult choices, ones that would define the early years of his reign, and soon he would prove that though he was young, he was not weak. With his throne secured, Solomon now faced a challenge far greater than political rivals, leading an entire nation. He was young, untested, and stepping into the shoes of his father David, one of the greatest kings Israel had ever known. The weight of responsibility pressed upon him, and he knew he could not rule alone. One night, something extraordinary happened. As Solomon slept, the Lord appeared to him in a dream. A divine voice called out, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Imagine being given that opportunity: wealth beyond measure, a kingdom of endless power, victory over every enemy. Solomon could have chosen anything. Yet, in an act that would define his legacy, he made a request that shocked even heaven itself. "Give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people, and to distinguish between right and wrong." He did not ask for riches. He did not seek revenge on his enemies. He did not long for fame. Instead, he sought wisdom to lead with justice and righteousness. God was pleased. "Since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be." And as a reward for his selfless request, God gave him even more: wealth, honor, and power beyond any king of his time. There would be no equal to Solomon in wisdom or prosperity. The first test of this divine gift came almost immediately. Two women, both prostitutes, stood before Solomon with a tragic case. They lived in the same house, had both given birth around the same time, but one of the babies had died. Now each woman claimed the living child was hers. There were no witnesses, no evidence, no way to prove the truth. The court watched in silence. Then Solomon spoke. "Bring me a sword." A gasp rippled through the court as a servant handed him a blade. "Cut the living child in two and give half to each woman." The first woman's face twisted in horror. She fell to her knees, sobbing. "No, my lord, give her the baby. Please, just let the child live." But the second woman remained cold. "Yes, divide him. If I can't have him, neither shall she." Solomon turned to his guards. "Give the baby to the first woman. She is the true mother." His judgment was swift, brilliant, and undeniable. Words spread like wildfire across Israel. God had truly given Solomon a wisdom unlike any other. Soon rulers from distant lands came to hear him speak, bringing gifts and seeking counsel. His name became legendary, his proverbs recorded, his insights sought by the greatest minds of his time. But wisdom, as he would later discover, is not enough to keep a man from folly, for even the wisest of kings can be led astray. With wisdom beyond human understanding and the divine favor of God, Solomon ushered in an era unlike anything Israel had ever seen. It was a time of prosperity, peace, and splendor. His kingdom stretched far and wide, from the Euphrates River to the borders of Egypt. Every neighboring nation paid tribute, bringing gold, spices, and rare treasures to his court. Under Solomon's rule, Israel became the wealthiest and most powerful kingdom of its time. But his greatest achievement, the one that would define his legacy for generations, was the construction of a house for the Lord. For years, his father David had longed to build a temple for God, a permanent resting place for the Ark of the Covenant. But God had denied him this honor, declaring that it would be his son Solomon who would build it instead. And so, in the 4th year of his reign, Solomon began a task unlike any before. The temple was to be the most magnificent structure ever built. Its foundation stones were quarried from deep within the earth. The finest cedar wood was shipped from Lebanon, provided by King Hiram of Tyre. Gold, silver, and precious stones adorned its walls. Every detail was crafted with care, for this was not just a building, it was the dwelling place of God among his people. For 7 years, thousands of workers labored day and night, and finally, the day of dedication arrived. As the priests carried the ark into the Holy of Holies, a thick cloud descended upon the temple. The glory of the Lord filled the house. The people fell to their knees in awe as Solomon lifted his hands toward heaven and prayed. "The heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built?" His prayer was a plea for mercy, for guidance, for the Lord's presence to never depart from Israel. And God responded with fire from heaven, consuming the sacrifices on the altar. It was a sign that he had accepted Solomon's offering. From that day forward, the temple stood as the heart of Israel's worship. But Solomon's greatness was not only in his wealth or his buildings, it was in his wisdom, which attracted rulers from all over the world. One of the most famous visitors was the Queen of Sheba. She had heard of his legendary insight and came to test him with hard questions. She arrived with a caravan of camels, bringing gold, precious stones, and the finest spices. Yet despite her riches, it was Solomon's wisdom that left her breathless. After speaking with him, she confessed, "The reports I heard in my own land were true, but I did not believe them until I came and saw with my own eyes. Not even half was told to me. Your wisdom and prosperity far exceed the reports I heard." And she left, marveling at the king who had everything. For decades, Solomon ruled with unmatched prosperity. Silver was as common as stones in Jerusalem, and ships sailed across distant seas, bringing wealth from faraway lands. The people of Israel lived in peace, their enemies subdued, their nation thriving. It seemed as though nothing could ever bring this golden age to an end. But the higher a man rises, the greater the fall. For while Solomon was wise in many things, he was blind in one, and the very thing that he had warned others about would become his greatest weakness. For years, Solomon had everything: wisdom, wealth, power, and divine favor. But power has a way of making even the strongest men vulnerable. At first, Solomon ruled with righteousness, honoring God in all he did. But slowly, something began to change. It started with small compromises. As a king, he needed alliances to maintain peace and expand his influence. And in the ancient world, the most effective way to seal alliances was through marriage. One by one, he took foreign wives, daughters of kings from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and Egypt. Each marriage brought political stability, wealth, and strengthened trade routes. But they also brought something far more dangerous: foreign gods. By the time Solomon was old, his harem had grown to 700 wives and 300 concubines. And these women did more than share his palace. They turned his heart. Slowly, the once devoted king began to tolerate their customs. At first, it was harmless: small shrines hidden within the royal courts, private altars tucked away from public sight. But over time, those hidden altars became grand temples, built on the hills surrounding Jerusalem. Solomon, the same man who built the temple of the one true God, now oversaw the construction of altars to Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Milcom, the detestable god of the Ammonites, and worst of all, Molech, a god who demanded child sacrifice. The people of Israel watched in disbelief. The king, who once called upon the Lord with reverence, was now bowing before statues of stone. And God saw everything. The Lord had appeared to Solomon twice, had blessed him beyond measure, had fulfilled every promise he had given. But Solomon, once wise, once faithful, had turned away. So, God declared judgment. "Since you have turned your heart away from me, I will tear the kingdom from you and give it to one of your servants. Yet for the sake of your father David, I will not do this in your lifetime. Instead, I will tear it from the hands of your son." For the first time in his life, Solomon faced the wrath of the God who had once delighted in him. The golden age of Israel was coming to an end. And in the shadows of his magnificent palace, enemies were already rising. For years, Solomon had everything: wisdom, wealth, power, and divine favor. But power has a way of making even the strongest men vulnerable. At first, Solomon ruled with righteousness, honoring God in all he did. He upheld justice, followed the laws of Moses, and remained faithful in worship. But slowly, something began to change. It started with small compromises. As a king, he needed alliances to maintain peace and expand his influence. And in the ancient world, the most effective way to seal alliances was through marriage. One by one, he took foreign wives, daughters of kings from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and Egypt. Each marriage brought political stability, wealth, and strengthened trade routes. But they also brought something far more dangerous: foreign gods. At first, Solomon resisted. He continued worshiping the Lord alone. But his wives, with their charm and persistence, begged him to respect their traditions. They longed for temples, for altars, for sacred places to worship the deities they had known since childhood. Solomon, the man of wisdom, the king who wrote, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge," found himself reasoning, "If this will keep my kingdom stable, if this will please my wives, what harm is there in allowing it?" So he allowed them to build shrines in secret. Then he permitted them to worship openly. Then he built high places for them outside the city. And before long, he was standing beside them, offering incense to gods he once despised. By the time Solomon was old, his harem had grown to 700 wives and 300 concubines. And these women did more than share his palace. They turned his heart. Solomon, the same man who built the temple of the Lord, now oversaw the construction of altars to Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Milcom, the detestable god of the Ammonites, and worst of all, Molech, a god who demanded child sacrifice. The hills around Jerusalem became places of pagan worship. The city that once echoed with psalms of praise now rang with foreign prayers and idol worship. The land that God had set apart as holy was now filled with abominations. The people of Israel watched in disbelief. The king who once called upon the Lord with reverence was now bowing before statues of stone. The ruler who once warned against the seduction of sin was now consumed by it. And God saw everything. The Lord had appeared to Solomon twice, had blessed him beyond measure, had fulfilled every promise he had given. But Solomon, once wise, once faithful, had turned away. So God declared judgment. "Since you have turned your heart away from me, I will tear the kingdom from you and give it to one of your servants. Yet for the sake of your father David, I will not do this in your lifetime. Instead, I will tear it from the hands of your son." Solomon had built a kingdom unlike any before. He had ruled with wisdom, established peace, and brought Israel into its golden age. But now, he had sown the seeds of its destruction. For the first time in his life, Solomon faced the wrath of the God who had once delighted in him. The golden age of Israel was coming to an end. And in the shadows of his magnificent palace, enemies were already rising. For decades, Solomon had ruled over a kingdom that flourished under his wisdom. He had built a magnificent temple for God, established peace, and ushered in Israel's golden age. But now, as an old man, his kingdom was crumbling, and he had only himself to blame. The warning had been clear. God had appeared to Solomon not once, but twice, reminding him to remain faithful, to walk in obedience, to keep the covenant that had been given to his father David. But Solomon had ignored it. His foreign wives had turned his heart toward their gods, and with each altar he built, he placed another stone in the path of his own downfall. So God spoke to him one last time. "Because you have done this and have not kept my covenant, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your servants. However, for the sake of your father David, I will not do this in your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hands of your son." The judgment was set. The kingdom that Solomon had worked so hard to establish would not last beyond him. His own son would see it divided. His legacy, once built on wisdom and righteousness, would end in rebellion and ruin. And already, trouble was stirring. Enemies began rising against him. Enemies that God himself allowed to bring unrest. From the south, Hadad the Edomite, a prince who had once fled from King David's conquests, returned with a burning desire for revenge. From the north, Rezon of Damascus, who had once served under the defeated King Hadadezer of Zobah, began building his own kingdom, strengthening Syria's hold against Israel. But the greatest threat of all came from within. One of Solomon's own officials, Jeroboam, a young and ambitious leader, was approached by the prophet Ahijah, and what the prophet told him would change history forever. Ahijah took his cloak, tore it into 12 pieces, and handed Jeroboam 10 of them. "This is what the Lord says. I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. Only one tribe will remain for the sake of David and Jerusalem, the city I have chosen." Jeroboam was stunned. He had been a loyal servant, a leader of Solomon's labor force. But now, God had chosen him to rule most of Israel. Word soon reached Solomon. Furious and desperate to protect his throne, he sought to kill Jeroboam. But Jeroboam fled to Egypt, where Pharaoh Shishak offered him refuge. Solomon, once the wisest man on earth, was now a paranoid king, fearing betrayal at every turn. His own mistakes had set in motion events that he could not stop. His once glorious reign had become a slow, painful unraveling. And as his life neared its end, the man who had built God's temple found himself lost in a temple of idols. The king who had once spoken with God now sat in silence, haunted by the consequences of his own decisions. His wisdom had not saved him from his desires. His power had not protected him from his downfall. And soon, Solomon would be gone, leaving behind a kingdom on the brink of collapse. In his final years, Solomon, the man who had everything, began to reflect on what it all meant. The wisdom, the wealth, the power. Had it truly satisfied him? Had it all been worth it? His reign had started with glory, but it was ending in sorrow. The kingdom was fractured, his enemies were rising, and the favor of God had departed from him. And so Solomon did what he had always done, he wrote. But this time, his words were not filled with the confidence of a young king or the insights of a ruler at his peak. Instead, they were the reflections of an old man, weary from the weight of his own mistakes. And the words he wrote would echo through history. Meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. This was the opening line of Ecclesiastes, a book unlike any other in the Bible. It was not a song of praise like Psalms, nor was it a book of divine laws like Deuteronomy. It was raw, unfiltered, and deeply human. Solomon had learned that wisdom without obedience leads to despair. He had pursued pleasure. He built palaces, planted vineyards, gathered silver and gold. He had denied himself nothing his heart desired. Yet, in the end, he called it all a chasing after the wind. He had sought knowledge, tried to understand the world through wisdom, and yet he concluded, with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. He had built a legacy, a kingdom that stretched across the nations. Yet he lamented, I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And he was right. The kingdom would not remain whole. His son, Rehoboam, would be the one to lose it all. Through Ecclesiastes, Solomon warned future generations not to make the same mistakes he did. He had lived for himself. He had chased after wealth, after pleasure, after wisdom itself. And in the end, he realized only one thing truly mattered. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. This was his final lesson, the conclusion of a life filled with highs and lows, wisdom and folly, obedience and rebellion. And not long after writing these words, Solomon, the once great king, died. His passing was not met with the same grandeur as his rise. There were no grand processions, no divine affirmations, no moment of triumph. He was buried in the city of David, and his son, Rehoboam, took the throne. But within a single generation, the mighty kingdom of Israel would be torn apart, just as God had promised. Solomon had been the wisest man on earth, but even wisdom could not save him from the consequences of his own heart. And so his story serves as both a warning and a lesson. Wisdom is a gift, but it means nothing without faithfulness to God. Solomon's story was written in history, his rise and fall recorded in Scripture. But over time, legends began to emerge, stories that hinted at powers beyond wisdom, secrets hidden from the pages of the Bible. The most mysterious of these was the legend of Solomon's ring. Some ancient writings claim that Solomon possessed a magical ring, a gift from heaven, said to give him dominion over the spiritual world. This ring, sometimes called the Seal of Solomon, was believed to be inscribed with the name of God and held supernatural power. According to tradition, it allowed Solomon to command spirits and demons, forcing them to do his bidding. Some accounts say that he used this power to build the great temple of Jerusalem, ordering supernatural beings to cut stones, transport materials, and construct the holy site faster than any human labor could achieve. Other writings suggest that the ring granted him knowledge beyond earthly wisdom, unlocking secrets of the universe that no other man could comprehend. One of the most famous legends comes from the Testament of Solomon, an ancient apocryphal text. It tells the story of a young boy in Solomon's court who was being tormented by a demon. When the king prayed to God for help, the archangel Michael appeared and gave him a ring with a divine seal. With this ring, Solomon was able to subdue the demon and force it to reveal its secrets. The story goes even further. Solomon, now armed with this divine power, summoned and bound many spirits, learning their names, their purposes, and the ways they operated in the world. Some say he wrote these secrets down, creating a book of knowledge that has since been lost to time. But if Solomon truly had such power, what happened to it? Some versions of the legend claim that he lost the ring due to his sins, just as he lost the kingdom. Others say that it was thrown into the sea, hidden forever. And yet, even today, the symbol of Solomon's seal, a hexagram or interlaced triangles, appears in mystical and religious traditions, from ancient text to medieval occultism. Could there be truth in these legends? Or were they simply myths, created to explain the incredible wisdom and authority Solomon once wielded? The Bible does not speak of the ring. It does not confirm or deny its existence. But one truth remains. Solomon's greatest power was never in gold or wealth or even wisdom. His greatest power was his connection to God. And when he turned away, no ring, no seal, no knowledge could save him. Solomon's life was a paradox, an epic story of divine wisdom and human weakness, of breathtaking triumph and heartbreaking failure. He began his reign as a man after God's own heart, gifted with wisdom beyond understanding, and entrusted with the most sacred task of all, building a house for the Lord. His kingdom flourished, his name became known across nations, and his counsel was sought by kings and queens from distant lands. And yet, for all his wisdom, Solomon's greatest downfall was his own heart. The wealth, the alliances, the foreign wives, and their gods slowly pulled him away from the very foundation that had made him great. His relationship with God. His story serves as a powerful reminder that no amount of wisdom, power, or success can protect a person from their own desires. Even the wisest man in history could not escape the consequences of turning away from God. But Solomon's final words, written in the book of Ecclesiastes, offer us something more than just a cautionary tale. They offer redemption. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. In the end, Solomon understood that all his achievements were meaningless without faithfulness. His regrets became lessons for future generations, a message that echoes through time. Wisdom is valuable, but obedience to God is essential. As we reflect on Solomon's life, we are left with questions for our own. What are the desires that pull us away from what we know is right? How often do we chase after things that seem valuable but, in the end, leave us empty? And perhaps the most important question of all, are we living with the wisdom that comes from God, or relying on our own understanding? Solomon's story isn't just history, it's a mirror reflecting the struggles we all face. His rise and fall remind us that every decision matters, and every compromise carries consequences. If this story has made you think, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. What lessons from Solomon's life resonate with you the most? And if you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others who might need these reminders of faith, wisdom, and obedience. Thank you for watching, and may you walk in wisdom and faithfulness every day of your life.